In this video, we'll look at some issues we can face when onboarding switches to Ruckus One. We will then see how to troubleshoot these issues. Let's first discuss the process of onboarding a switch to Ruckus One. Administrators can onboard switches with a factory default configuration, as well as switches with existing configurations. If you bring in a factory defaulted switch, you will be able to select the type of code, switch, or route for some models. Each venue in Ruckus One has its own switch firmware settings, which is dependent on the mix of switches within the venue. Adding a new switch within a venue where switches already exist may place different firmware on the device than a newly created venue with no switches. You can observe the venue firmware from Administration, Version Management, Switch Firmware. As shown, Ruckus One breaks down the venue firmware levels per model, showing which release each venue is currently running. Selecting a venue and choosing Change Update Schedule will allow you to see the range of firmware available within the venue, with lower-level firmware called out as downgrades. You can also see options to keep firmware at existing revisions by choosing Do Not Update Firmware on these switches. Onboarding a switch requires certain firmware versions, primarily ones that support Ruckus One. It is a good practice to go ahead and put the current firmware that your target venue is running on the device before onboarding. Ruckus One can usually do this for you as well, but if you have a venue with older firmware or the device you are attempting to add is a little older with regard to firmware versions, it can get stuck onboarding. One way to determine what the current switch version is to issue the CLI command show version on the switch, which will display what version of code it is running. Our switch is currently running 9.0.10j CD2T241, which does meet the minimum requirement for Ruckus One connections. Once the device has onboarded to the venue fully, upgrading or downgrading firmware from the UI is possible from a venue level. Remember, Ruckus One treats ICX 8200 separate from the rest of the ICX models from a firmware perspective, so you will have to manage each independently. Let's say that switch that we want to add is already compatible from a firmware perspective. Going back to the switch list, we can see we have switches added and operational. However, during the initial onboarding process, we may receive a Never Contacted the Cloud status. In cases where your switch gets stuck on this status, we can troubleshoot this issue using some simple steps. First, when adding a switch to Ruckus One, we need to ensure we have the serial number for the device entered correctly. You can also utilize the Ruckus One mobile app to scan the serial number when adding a switch to ensure that the serial number does not get mistyped. We talked about firmware and the serial numbers in terms of adding switches. Next, we need to talk about the firewall. Ruckus One requires specific URLs to be whitelisted, IP ranges to be identified and whitelisted, and certain ports to be open for proper operation. You can see a list of the current requirements in the Ruckus One online help guide. Search for firewall ports to open for Ruckus One. Once we are sure those connections are flowing correctly, we can be confident that it's not a firewall issue. We can then move on checking the status of the connection between the switch and Ruckus One. Next, we can visually check the LEDs on the switch. Most ICX switches include a CLD LED that gives us a visual indicator of the status of the connection to the cloud. If it is solid green, that means the switch has connected to Ruckus One successfully. If it is a slow green flash, one flash every 2 seconds, this indicates that the switch is attempting, or is in process of, connecting to the cloud. If it is a fast flash, 2 flashes every second, this indicates that the switch is receiving configurations from the cloud. This could be either a configuration change or firmware update. Note, We could also see an amber flash when the switch is receiving configuration updates. If the LED shows connectivity status, but is not showing up in Ruckus 1, make sure the switch is not currently being managed by a Smart Zone instance, which will also cause the LED light to be solid green. Finally, if the LED is off, that means the switch is disconnected from the cloud, and the device will show as never contacted the cloud. We then need to investigate the switch CLI to continue to troubleshoot. The next logical step in trying to troubleshoot a switch connecting to the cloud would be to log into the switch to try and figure out what's wrong from a network connectivity standpoint. What we need to do is start a CLI session and check the switch configuration. We can access the CLI using a tool like PuTTY, as we're showing here. Once the connection is established, we can test connectivity by issuing a ping command. In this case, we're attempting to ping one of the addresses that Ruckus 1 uses. We can see we have a failure. Using the show run command, we can check the switch configuration. This gives us a lot of detail, specifically the configuration of the IP, gateway, and DNS configured. We can see that we have no DNS configuration. This means that a ping of an IP address would work, but a ping of the DNS name did not. This would prevent our switch from reaching Ruckus 1 properly. Here we can get into configuration mode and add a DNS address to our device. Then save the configuration. Now, if we test the ping again, we can see it is now successful. After making these changes, it takes a few seconds for the LEDs to cycle and finally settle on a solid green. At the same time, the status of the switch on Ruckus 1 should update until it reaches operational. This problem could occur if the device used static IP addressing and did not have DNS server IP address or IP default gateway assigned. If we use DHCP or dynamic addressing instead, then this issue is less likely to occur unless the DNS server assigned is down or DHCP is misconfigured. The IP configuration of your device is dependent on code versions. If the device is running router code, as shown here for this ICX 8200, you may need to also make sure that a default route exists. Or you may also have management addressing configured on a VE interface. The same ping test will still tell you if you have a working connection, but if the pings fail, you may have additional considerations to make. However, if your device can ping, meaning its IP address, default gateway, and DNS entries are correct, but you still do not have connectivity to Ruckus 1, we can move on to other possible issues. The next thing we can do is check the manager status from the CLI with the command show manager status, which indicates if the device has a connection to Ruckus 1. The first thing that we should see is if the config status and operation status are enabled. If these were disabled, the switch wouldn't be trying to connect to the cloud. If the config status is disabled, we would need to check the configuration to make sure that Manager Disable is not present. If it is, we would need to issue the No Manager Disable command to re-enable it. Once it is enabled, the Manager Reset command can be used to restart the management connectivity. You can rerun the Show Manager Status command after resetting to check the status. The Status command will display the Ruckus 1 host controllers that we're trying to connect to by IP and DNS host name. We can also see if a response is received from the cloud, and more importantly, that the NATS tunnel is connected. A state of NATS connected is the result of a switch that is fully operational within Ruckus 1. However, the status might sometimes say never contacted or in progress. Once connected, that means that both sides have communicated, have been able to set up the tunnel, and are communicating over that tunnel. Additionally, you can use commands like Show Manager Stream Status or Show Manager TCP Connections to check for a healthy connection. Activity in the output shown on these commands indicates a connection between the device and Ruckus One. Hopefully, this helps resolve issues with switches joining the cloud. A good practice is to always check the release notes for the version that you are running to see if there's any specific requirements when connecting to Ruckus One.